Nate Smith. I'm the director and curator of the Dinosaur Institute, and one of our favorite parts about Dino Fest is inviting visiting paleontologists from around the globe to come and speak a little bit about their research. So thank you all for joining us, but I also want you to welcome Dr. Alan Turner, who comes to us from Stony Brook University. Dr. Turner will discuss his work on a group of theropod dinosaurs known as Paraves. Now, this group includes iconic dinosaurs like Velociraptor. In fact, Alan was the one that proved Velociraptor was feathered, as well as birds and their earliest relatives. He'll highlight how discoveries from Madagascar offer insights into the transition to birds. Alan received his PhD in 2008 in vertebrate paleontology at Columbia University and the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. But I'll make his paragraph bio longer by saying we were both master's students at the University of Iowa together. Go Hawks. Currently, Alan is a professor and chair of the Department of Anatomical Sciences at Stony Brook University in New York. His research centers on the morphological evolution and phylogeny of advanced theropod dinosaurs and Mesozoic crocodile relatives. Fieldwork has taken Alan to collect fossils around the world in places like Mongolia, Kenya, Madagascar, South Africa, and the American Southwest. He's named more than 13 species of dinosaur or close dinosaur relatives, and 7 species of fossil crocodiles. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan H. Turner.
All right, so hi everybody, thanks for coming out, and thanks to Nate and Luis for inviting me along. I really appreciate it. I guess a little bit of background for me. So as Nate said, I work in an anatomy department at Stony Brook University, and so I teach human anatomy to first-year medical students. So part of the time, what I'm doing is thinking about bones and soft tissue of humans over here on the right, and I use that kind of detailed knowledge and information that I have about humans to train or help train the next generation of doctors. But when I'm not thinking about those kinds of bones, I'm thinking about a very different set of bones, and sometimes some of the soft tissue that preserves with it. And for that, we use that to sort of try and get a better understanding of what's happening through evolution and how life has been changing, over time. And so, especially for me, I'm interested in looking at these questions with specifics to dinosaur and crocodile evolution. And paleontologists use these details on the skeleton and sometimes these soft tissue things, to build phylogenies about dinosaurs. And what I mean by that so dinosaur phylogenies, you can think of these as like a family tree showing the branching patterns of these species through time. And so this tells us how they're related to each other, but they're also a central tool that paleontologists use to understand big evolutionary transitions, like the evolution of flight, which I'm talking about a little bit today, and Dr. Balanoff will be again here at 2:30. So flight's a pretty kind of a bonkers thing if you think about it, right? It's only evolved 4 times in the history of life. The first time it was within insects, and then twice within reptiles. So first within pterosaurs on the bottom right, and then again within birds, and then most recently within bats. Okay, so it hasn't happened a lot of times. But when it does happen, I guess it's pretty great because every time it has occurred, these groups have gone off and become incredibly diverse. So if we look within insects, right, which is already the most diverse animal group, just 40% of all species of insects are beetles. So we're not even talking about all flying insects, just of this subset of flying insects. Beetles represent 40% of species for that. We don't really have these numbers for pterosaurs. My guess is they're probably going to fit the same pattern. But if we think about birds, they're representing 50% of all reptile species. So it's fair to think of birds as reptiles, right? And so there are as many species of birds as there are if you went out and collected every species of lizard, snake, and crocodile. And mammals aren't that far off too. Bats, 20% of all bird species are bats. So there's something about evolving flight that is top notch. You go on and you make a ton of species with it, okay? And flight itself is a pretty extraordinary behavior to engage in. It's incredibly complex. It requires a ton of coordination. You have to make a whole host of changes to your skeleton, to your muscular system, to your brain, and like the neurological system you have. And again, so that part of it, I'm going to plug Dr. Balanoff again. He's talking at 2:30 because she's one of the world's leading experts on the sort of the neurological changes that are happening within dinosaurs in order to do really complicated, sophisticated things like that. But in the case of birds, one of the other changes that are taking place, right, is that they're really going and modifying heavily their forelimb and hand from what was originally, like a tool for grasping and interacting with the environment to this really heavily specialized flight surface. And so some people think even that change, that loss of the forelimb as a way of interacting with your environment, maybe it was a driving factor in some of the really high levels of diversity we see within bird faces, within their beaks. Because bird beaks evolved pretty early on in bird evolution. So once you start being a bird, you start doing things with your beak. And some of that is thought to be sort of that trade-off of you've lost your hand and your arm as a grasping tool, and now you need some other part of your anatomy to serve that bit. So how do we go from something like this early theropod taua here on the right-hand side? How do we get from there to there? How do we turn this to a bird, right? And how do we as paleontologists really kind of go about understanding that transition? So one of the ways we do it, and one of the ways that I engage in doing it, is by trying to go out and find new fossils and fit them into that family tree of dinosaurs to better understand that transition. So as Nate mentioned, I've been fortunate to go and do fieldwork in a lot of very interesting places like Kenya and Mongolia, within the United States and New Mexico with Dave, and as well as Madagascar and South Africa. And so going and finding fossils in these locations, it's really the only path to put yourself right at the scene of when these events are happening, right? We can go to these places, we can find a new species, we figure out where they fit into that evolutionary history of dinosaurs. And it's really providing this direct window into the events we're interested in looking at, as close to the moment in time as we can get of those events occurring. And where this is taking place for birds is in this part of the family tree of dinosaurs that I've marked here with the yellow star, this group called Paraves, okay? Because this includes birds, it's some of the diversity that you see up at the top of the diagram, as well as things like dromaeosaurs and troodonids. So most people are probably familiar with a number of dromaeosaurs, particularly Velociraptor, because it is kind of probably made famous by the initial and so many subsequent Jurassic Park movies. But it in fact has, and if we were to kind of freeze things where they were 20 or 30 years ago, there was only really a small subset of dromaeosaurs known, and they were all pretty similar looking to each other. And it kind of fit this Velociraptor Deinonychus body plan. But that hasn't proved to hold as we go and find new things. So, one of the things I was able to work on actually stemmed from one of these specimens of Velociraptor that came from the Gobi, where we found, as Nate alluded to in my introduction, right, some evidence for feathers being present on animals like Velociraptor. And so what we found was along this bone that I'm showing here at the top, that's the ulna, so it's one of the lower arm bones. And along the back side of that ulna, we found these really regularly spaced, although really small bumps along the ulna. And that's what the arrows are indicating there. And we compared these against what we see in modern birds, so like a turkey vulture is on showing here, right? So the size is obviously pretty different, but the location and the spacing is what you'd expect for where a feather is in fact attached to the ulna. So these are called quill knobs because there's like a ligamentous system that runs from the quill and embeds it down into the bone, taking a grip there. And so this was some of the first direct evidence of feathers within an animal like Velociraptor, which we know is of a size and a place within the tree that it definitely wasn't flying. You push Velociraptor off of a branch, and it's definitely falling pretty hard.
Keeps buzzed.
But we also had other additional discoveries from Mongolia that added to the family tree of dromaeosaurs. So, and doing so, it really expanded what we knew about the geographic range, so where they occurred through time and space, and also about their differences in size and our morphology. So this is an animal that we named Sagomagus, which is really closely related to Velociraptor. There's also some additional discoveries. So we're looking at the pelvis. This is like a top-down view, so it's sort of like laying on its back with its legs spread. So we're like top-down view of its pelvis, and on the bottom we're seeing its right leg, its femur tibia, and then down the foot on the far right side of the screen, and you can see those large sickle claws that dromaeosaurs are known from. So this is an animal we named Shritivi. It's closely related to some additional dromaeosaur material that we described recently named Kurukula. This has considerably less material known, but it preserved, seeing like a lower jaw, part of the limb, the forearm. And collectively, all of these Gobi dromaeosaurs are important for us understanding just how much diversity of dromaeosaurs you can have in one particular location, right? We have multiple species of dromaeosaur, all known from like similar localities. And it also provides like interesting input into, like I said before, changes in size and shape and such. So this is another, here, this is all we know from this animal. It's a species that we named Shanag. And this is from older rocks in Mongolia. So these are, all of the Velociraptor and Shri, these are all late Cretaceous. These are 70 million year old animals. But Shanag is known from early Cretaceous rocks. And so this is about 150, 160 million year olds. And it's, as you can see, highlighted in red, in an earlier part of the trees from dromaeosaurs. So it's starting to kind of expand out the diversity of the group. There's also these bizarre animals like Balur, which is known from Romania in Europe, and it too adds some weird diversity to the group. On the far left side of that image, we're looking at what we know of its hand, and so you see it just has two main functional fingers. It has pretty much completely reduced its third digit down to just a tiny little nub. And I don't know if it's easy to tell. I forgot to bring a pointer, so I'm going to walk over here. I told you I wasn't going to do this, and now I'm doing it. You can see the two claws, right? Some dromaeosaurs normally have just this one single claw on their foot. Balur is interesting because it's taken its first digit and it decided to do pretty much the same thing with it as well. So it's got this sort of double sickle claw on its foot.
That's good.
I've also worked on descriptions of these weird four-winged animals called microraptors. Here is a picture of Chungu raptor, which I actually worked nicely enough with Dr. Chiaffi over there, who's kind enough to invite me onto the project as we were working on it. And so again, this helped us understand and fill out this part of the tree, and we see that we have dromaeosaurs like this that are quite different than what we see at Velociraptor. This is a small sort of like hawk-sized animal. And perhaps one of the most exciting dromaeosaurs that I participated in discovering was this animal that we named Mahakala. So it is the earliest known dromaeosaur. So it's like one of the first branches off of the diversity. It's known from late Cretaceous of Mongolia, so it occurs late in time. But based off of its anatomy, right, based off of the parts of its skeleton that we can study compared to other ones, it was one of the first splits off. And the reason why this is important, and the reason why I'm talking so much about dromaeosaurs when I was saying I'm going to talk about some of the things about birds, is that if we want to understand these changes that lead to flight, right? If we want to understand changes that make you a bird, you really need to know what's happening at the origin of all of these groups. You need to understand birds, but you also need to understand dromaeosaurs and troodontids, because you have to rely kind of collectively on all of this information to get you back to the root. It's through that information that we can figure out, well, what's like the ancestral state? What is the original condition that these three groups sort of were independently evolving from? And so you need to look across it. You just can't focus on birds. You need to compare it against other relatives. So having this diversity of forms within dromaeosaurs become really important. in part because, right, Mahakala, this is a very small animal. Again, this is like a pigeon-sized animal. So understanding that, yeah, early in the evolution of dromaeosaurs, these weren't these big animals like Velociraptor. They were in fact quite small, like you'd expect from some of the earliest birds. And the same true if we go look at the earliest Troodonid, this is a pretty small animal. But Mahakala certainly wasn't flying. It had short little stubby arms whose bones were really squished laterally, and in a morphology that nobody really quite sure why they're that way. So this is Rohan avis. So this is one of the few dromaeosaurs that are actually known from the southern hemisphere. So most of the dromaeosaur diversity is all from North America and Asia. But Rohan avis was the first to be found from like I said, the southern hemisphere continent. This animal is interesting because it in fact was so similar to birds that when it was initially discovered, it was thought to be a bird. And it wasn't until much later, in subsequent discoveries that happened in Argentina, that it became apparent that in fact it belongs to this really unique bird-like group of dromaeosaurs called twinenlodines. And so the images I'm showing here are of what the bones of Rohan avis looked like when they were discovered. So that top frame over in 2, we're looking at portions of the pelvis. In 4, we're seeing bones of the shoulder. And over in 3, that's like its tail and part of the leg, all spread out. As I said, what do they look like in the rock when they were discovered? So these discoveries collectively, right, they helped change our view of what velociraptors and dromaeosaurs looked like, right? From a thing that was much more similar to what we were shown in the original Jurassic Park that I was a kid for, into something that looks far more like this, right? A far more bird-like thing. If you saw it running around now, you'd be confused as to like why there's this crazy chicken bird thing. And it paints a much bigger picture, right, of what dromaeosaur, the family looks like if you went and looked at all these dromaeosaurs. And we see that they're incredibly diverse, right? We have this massive size range. We have animals. I'm going to do it again. I realized I didn't bring a pointer, so I can't point in these things. So you think like Utah raptor and Gila, these are North America and Asia. These are huge, huge animals, right? These are like 15, 20 feet long, way over 1,000 pounds. But you also have like the tiny stuff like Mahakala that I talked about, right? That this is, maybe a pound. This is like pigeon, big hawk-sized animals. And a big diversity of little forms like those four-winged Microraptors. And these weird, long-snouted animals, these twinenlodines, they're all from the southern hemisphere, that look really different, right, than all of what we have from North America and Asia. I'm going to highlight Rohan avis here for a second, because it's a convenient segue to some of the stuff that I do in Madagascar. Rohan avis is from Madagascar. It was found in late Cretaceous rocks there. So this was a discovery that 30 years ago was maybe when Rohan avis was found. And the work that I do in Madagascar is part of this really long field project that I now participate with it. It was started by Dave Krause, who I'm showing up there, who was at Stony Brook where I work now. And I've been involved with this project for some number of years now too. And what we're doing in Madagascar is looking at late Cretaceous terrestrial deposits there. So it's the area highlighted in red on Madagascar in the bottom right-hand corner, and the arrow shows you what Madagascar might have looked like back in the late Cretaceous. So again, we're like 70-million-year-old rocks. And what we're finding there is a weird assortment of animals. We have Paravians, right? There's a dromaeosaur in there. We have like giant frogs, fish, huge mammals, and a bunch of theropod dinosaurs, and a wild diversity of crocs. And we are getting this weird assortment, we think, in part because like weird things happen on islands. If you're odd in isolation for a long time, evolution can like go and do weird things because you don't have a lot of stuff coming in, right? But it also reflects sort of a shared history. Madagascar was connected to Africa and South America for a very long time during the Mesozoic. And so like the initial group of animals that I brought over reflect that, right? So that was sort of the starting material, and then they went off and did weird things with it. So Paraves was one of these really important initial discoveries that were coming from Madagascar. And then the additional one that again happened around that same time was with this animal named Varuna, which was the first Mesozoic bird discovered in Madagascar when it was found. And it was known from mostly isolated hind leg material, so like lower leg, okay? And that was sort of how things stood for a number of years. By 10 or 15 years ago, we knew that there was going to be more birds present in Madagascar because we were finding isolated bits, right? So we could go and look. So the top thing, that's part of the sacrum. So it's like where the vertebrae that all fuse together that hold your pelvis. And within birds, so that top image is a sacrum, the bottom image is also a sacrum too, but with birds, through their evolutionary history, they add additional vertebrae to them. So you can look at the number of vertebrae, and it kind of tells you how early in bird evolution you are versus late in bird evolution. So we had like 2 different kinds that were pretty spread apart. We were finding isolated leg bones, that's a femur, the UA9607 on the left-hand side, that's the distal half, the bottom half of the humerus. Right, so we had these tantalizing clues that there's more birds to be found here, but we weren't finding them. That is until we did additional excavations in this quarry here that is very boringly named the 0542 quarry, but we often refer to it as a bird quarry because it has revealed like a trove of Paravian fossils that include really beautifully preserved postcranial skeletons, so like arms and legs and backbones, that we're still like working, getting through, describing the species that are coming out of that. But it definitely like doubled to maybe is going to triple the number of bird species that we know from these southern land masses in the Mesozoic. But one of the recent discoveries that probably steals the show is this thing here, which, believe it or not, is the skull of a bird. So this was a new bird with a very, very modern beak. It's this animal that we named Falcetakili. So the skull of it thing is only about that big, right? And it's incredibly delicate bone, and the only way we were able to study it, you couldn't have ever prepared this out of the rock. So the only way we were ever able to study it was by CT scanning it and having our digital preparator spend like over a year individually thresholding these elements so we could figure out like what's going on. And we went into to the extent where we digitally segmented it and we 3D printed them at like 4 times its size. So we could mess around with like, how does all this stuff fit together, right? Because this was a skull that was squished flat and then smeared, right? And so working through that material got us to something that now kind of made more sense. And you could see just how flat and sort of squished that thing was. So the thing about birds, right, is that, so this bird has this crazy beak, right? So birds have bones in their eyes called sclerotic rings. So you see that big ring, that's a great way to know where the eye is because it's literally bones in the eye. So we're looking at the eye and you see all of the bones in front of it. That's showing you the shape of the bird's beak or snout, right? And so it's quite long and built, and we joke about this as being our like Malagasy toucan, because it has this big toucanish like beak. So the thing to remember with birds though is that birds mostly form their beaks from one of the bones in their face called a premaxilla. So in this image, it's what I have highlighted in green and in red, okay? Whereas the maxilla is that orange color bone, right? So birds make their beaks primarily from making their premaxilla really big and making their maxilla kind of small, okay? That is not what this animal is doing, right? It has a crazy big maxilla and a tiny little premaxilla. So we were like, this is pretty weird. Is this really a bird? So we spent a lot of time, right, like making sure that we got it right. And so part of that process, again, is like looking at its anatomy, looking at its morphology. And what we were able to show is, in fact, yeah, this is a bird. Like, it has all of these features. I'm not going to go into depth of that, but it has all of these features that you really only find in birds. And moreover, it has additional features that you only really find in a specific group of birds called enantiornithians. So we can address this in a complex statistical framework that we use for building these trees. I'm definitely not going to talk about that. But again, it was able to like kind of give us a confident position of like, oh yeah, this is in fact a bird. It falls out from this particular tree. And this is another way of looking at it. There's Falcaticuli nesting in amongst this group of birds called Emantiornithines. And we can then think about how this bird is building its face in the context of how all of these other Mesozoic birds are building their faces. Okay, and so this reinforces that point I made just a second ago, right? Lots of birds in the Mesozoic thought it would be cool to make their faces really long, okay? And every time they did it, you'll notice that here, the premaxilla bone is in red. It's the premaxilla that gets big. And you either are reducing the green bone, the maxilla, or it's just kind of taking a back seat to an otherwise really big premax, okay? Falcaticuli is not, right? Big max, little tiny premax. So we wanted to kind of get at this in a slightly more rigorous way, so I reached out to a colleague of mine that works in the UK who does this technique called morphometrics. It's a way of like quantifying shape. And so we wanted to quantify shape and see just like how much Falcaticuli doesn't fit. So again, the only details that matter here is I've got that dotted red line. If you are to the left of that red line, you build your face like almost all other theropod dinosaurs do, okay? And if you're to the right side of that line, you build your face pretty much like all other birds do. You plop Falcaticuli into this, and you can see that that's the red star. It squarely falls into a group of dinosaurs that builds its face like all other theropods do, okay? So you can think about this as being like, okay, this is a bird that retains a primitive organization, right? It builds its face in a, like sort of an ancestral way, okay? This much more complicated graph, again, the only thing that you need to take home from this is that if we now looked at just the three-dimensional shape of this bird, along with the three-dimensional shape of 350 living bird sounds, okay? Because we want to see, look, does this, we think it looks like a toucan, but we're just like staring at it, right? What is it actually kind of shaped like? And this shows, so again, the red star is Falcaticuli, and what this shows is that indeed, Falcaticuli's face, it's the way it forms its beak, falls in with a group of birds that includes toucans, tropic birds, and these tyrant flycatchers. So although it's building its face in a very ancestral way, in a very primitive theropod way, it has used that sort of underlying anatomical hardware, and it's gone and done and made a very modern beak with it, okay? So why is that important? So sort of two, I think, kind of take-home points from that. So it's rare that we get these glimpses into, like we can't look at genes and developmental pathways within fossils, right? So it's rare that we have these instances where we can look at something like how you construct a complex integrated structure like a beak and see if you are doing it in a new way or you're doing it in an old way. And in this case, it showed, yeah, this is a bird that's retained a really ancestral way of building its beak. And that was surprising because by where it is in the tree, where all these other birds it's with, your full expectation was, no, this is a thing that developmentally got locked in already. If you're a bird, you have to build your face this way. Falcaticuli doesn't do that. So now we see that, oh, maybe that thing we thought locked in really early on didn't get locked in really early on. Okay, so maybe there's a little bit more play with how you can be, right? It means we can anticipate perhaps some more diversity that we wouldn't have otherwise anticipated. And the last part is that not only did they retain this sort of way that you can build a face much longer than we thought, it turned out you can even build a modern beak, right? Using this underlying old structure. And that's a pretty, okay, that's I think a pretty important thing to realize. Is that, yeah, early in bird evolution, they had everything they needed to go off and explore these like morphologies and ecologies that we see by our birds occupied. So with that, I think I'll stop talking. And again, thanks everybody.